Morning and good afternoon, everyone. So it sounds like the sound check went well. That's always good news. Whether you are with us for the first time today or you're somebody who's with us regularly and we have a healthy mix of the two, I always like to start and actually pre-start even by just sharing with you that any questions, concerns, thoughts, stories that you may have regarding the command center or safety in general, we always want to have you share with us. And so we're excited to learn a little bit more about your school, the challenges that you've faced in the past, and again, any questions or specific areas of focus that you'd like to make sure that we cover today. So please feel free to share those with us on the right-hand side of your screen, or I should say on the right-hand side of your screen. There's a chat box there, and all of your chats will come directly to me today, and so I'll be able to see them and respond to them and make sure that we cover all of those topics for you throughout our conversation. And if this is the first time that you're watching one of our webinars, we are in the middle of a safety series, which is ironic, given that this entire year has been a safety series. That said, we are in the middle of a 10-part series, and today we're talking about the command center and the specific roles and responsibilities that they have. The command center is a little bit different. For the rest of the webinars on our series, or actually on our mini-series, we've actually suggested that you watch this webinar once with us live, ask questions, learn more, and then you watch the webinar again and apply the practices and the concepts that we discussed to your school. And then you watch the webinar again with the team that we're talking about. I don't necessarily anticipate that your command centers, and you'll find out a little bit more about who's supposed to be in them and why I think this, but I don't necessarily think that they'll be spending a great deal of time watching a webinar with you. And so I'll highlight a couple of key points as we go through the conversation today. And so if you don't already have it, maybe grab a notepad and a pen, and we'll make sure that we really mention those high importance or topics of high importance that you really do want to make sure that you share with your command center. Obviously, if they're willing to watch this with you or they're willing to watch it on their own time, even better. But if they won't or they don't, we want to make sure that you still do get them educated and get them the information that they need. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. My name's Chris, and I'm the founder and CEO of Joffe Emergency Services. And I've actually been with you now for the last three, or counting this one, the last three webinars. And we've been talking about some tough conversations, or talking about some tough things. We started talking about continuity a couple of webinars ago. Last week we talked about counseling, and we actually ran a little bit over time. Today we shouldn't do that. And today we're talking about the command center and the roles and responsibilities that it has. Well, we started this mini-series after starting a school safety series. So every Thursday at 10 a.m. Pacific or 1 p.m. Eastern, we've done, since the beginning of the school year, we've done a topic of some sort, whether it was a team focus or a concept that related to school safety, or sometimes even just a new product or a new partner that we have. And we've shared those things with you in an effort to help you empower your school and your community to be able to manage an emergency, whether it's small and just impacts one student, or large and impacts your entire community, or huge and impacts your entire neighborhood or region. And so specifically, we're talking about fires, earthquakes, lockdowns, tornadoes, hurricanes, but less specifically, we're also talking about how we manage really small and isolated incidents, a student that falls or a student that breaks an arm. Whether on campus or off, how do we manage that? How do we incorporate them into our day-to-day school operations without sacrificing anything that they're able to do or jeopardizing their safety? And we got started with this series because we're a school safety company. We actually started as a CPR and first aid training company, and we started training and working with schools, and they started saying, hey, can you do this? And we said, sure. And then they said, hey, can you do that? And we said, sure. And so what ended up happening was we were doing and working with more schools than anybody else. And sure enough, they're now our primary area of focus. And although we do look out to work with some other clients, in fact, I'll share with you next week at the beginning of our webinar, a huge client that we are excited to be talking about. Schools are our primary focus. And so that's just a little bit about who we are, and I won't bore you with a whole lot more. Let's go ahead and dive into what we're actually here to talk about today, and that is the command center. So today we'll start with what is the command center. That seems like a good place to start. We'll talk a little bit about what they do, a little bit about who belongs on the command center, how big it should be, the essential equipment for the command center, who they communicate with, and I'm not sure why there's a question mark there and not anywhere else, and the top 3 challenges for the command center. And as we go through this particular mini-series, this 10-part team-focused mini-series, you'll notice that these topics are very much recurring, and that's intentional. We want you to be able to show these webinars to your teams and make sure that they're really empowered and that we're setting them up all the exact same way. So if you're wondering why we're repeating these concepts or these topics, the what is, the what do they do, the who fits, what size, that's very much intentional, and it's so that you can really apply each of these concepts to the specific team that we're talking about. So what is a command center? That's where we have to start. It is your leadership team, and it is the team that's responsible for providing leadership throughout the entire emergency, from the time that it truly does begin to the time that it's over and complete, and actually on even past that when it moves into the continuity phase. One of the things that I like to do when I'm on campus and an emergency starts is I'll actually say to myself, is this a thing? And you'll find that sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. For example, I was on a campus the other day and there was a bomb threat that was received a few miles away. And in the threat, it implied that there could be some impact to schools in the local area. And the first question that we asked when we started looking at the threat and started looking at the news that was coming in and got on the phone with the police was, is this a thing? Is this something we even need to respond to? And based on all of the information that we had at the time, and based on reviewing the threat, talking with police, getting an understanding for what was actually going on, we decided, you know what, no, this one isn't. This isn't something we need to respond to. It's not something that we need to jump up and do anything about. This is literally something that we need to be aware of. We need to be mindful of as we get ready to do dismissal, and it happened to be about 1:30, so we were getting close. And this is something we need to be sort of focused on over the course of the next several hours and even days to make sure that it doesn't change a lot. But that particular day, we decided that wasn't quote unquote a thing. And by the way, if you're not familiar with the is this a thing concept, go to any of your oldest students, whether that's 12th graders or 8th graders or even kindergartners, and they can share a little bit more about what that is. The more common, though, result of that question or of that sort of almost litmus test is, well, yes, it is. And whether we need to respond in a big way or in a small way, we do need to respond. It is a thing. It's something we've got to do. So one of the things that I find that most schools do is that as soon as they identify that it's a thing or that it's something they need to respond to, they begin to assemble a team. And it's almost always a really, really small team, and it almost never involves all of the people from the command center. And this is the first important topic to at least jot down. As soon as you determine that the emergency that's going on, whether on campus or off, close or far, is something that you feel the entire community needs to respond to, you should assemble the command center. That doesn't need to be physically, right? If you're in a special schedule that day, if let's say it's this week and your head of school is at NIMS, and maybe the rest of your leadership team is there too, it doesn't mean that they need to fly back from NIMS in 5 minutes to be with you, but it does mean that they need to get onto a conference call with you, or at least open up a text message or GChat dialogue. So the goal is immediately upon understanding that we are going to respond, to assemble the team. Then the team has to do their job, and what they're supposed to do is to assess, make decisions, and then see how those decisions impacted the event or impacted the community. So for that same event, a bomb threat that was down the street, the first thing that we would have done, and in fact the first thing that we did do, was say, hey, you know what, we're aware of this incident. Even before we determine that we're going to respond in any way, shape, or fashion, let's gather the team. Let's make sure we're all on the same page. Let's find out what everybody knows, and then let's start making calls to local authorities and see what everybody else knows. So we did that. The team's together, the team's thinking about it. We decide, all right, you know what, we're not going to respond based on all the information we have. And then about 45 minutes later, we said, okay, we're done with this for right now, but let's come back together in 25 minutes and reassess. And when we do, let's just do it by chat, because at this point, we don't necessarily need to all show back up here in the office to figure out what's going on and what we need to do about it. In addition to actually making those decisions and dealing with some of the tough challenges that just go along with being a leader and being in charge, the team also has to be responsible for and actually do the external communication. So put differently, if they decide, hey, you know what, this is what we're going to do, they've got to tell somebody that they're doing it. And generally that somebody is your entire parent community. Sometimes it's the entire neighborhood. And in big emergencies or isolated to your school emergencies, like a lockdown that just happens on campus, that's actually a national or a nationwide communication that that team has to deliver. So there's some roles that have to be on that team. And we'll talk about a little bit more of how this came to be and why we look at the roles this way a little bit later. But for the meantime, there always has to be an incident commander. And for some of you, you actually work on a model that's called first on. And first on means that the first person who's aware of the incident, whether it's a broken arm or it's a lockdown or it's a fire, whatever the case may be, is the incident commander. So if I'm a PE teacher and I'm aware of a lockdown that should happen because I see somebody running onto the field while I'm out doing PE, I yell at the top of my lungs, "Lock down!" And everybody locks down. I'm the incident commander right now because I'm the person who's aware of and initiating the response to it. Others of you work in a situation where you might have that same empowerment, that same capacity for anybody on campus to, for example, say lockdown and have everybody else do it. But as soon as that happens, the incident commander is actually your head of school, or maybe your CFO, or maybe somebody else. Maybe it's your facilities director or somebody else altogether. And if that person's not there, then hopefully there's a succession list for people who can follow that person. So if your head of school is normally the incident commander and they're away at NAIS this week, then your assistant head would step up. If your assistant head is with them at NAIS, then maybe it would be a division director. If they're gone too, then maybe it would be a dean. If they're gone too, then maybe it would be the CFO. And you see where I'm going here. So there's always somebody that's available to step into that role. Regardless of whether you're the first on model or you're a little bit more structured model, you still have the same role as incident commander. That person is truly and solely responsible for everything that happens on campus from the time they're deemed incident commander until the time that somebody else takes over. In the course of the evolution of a, let's say, lockdown type emergency, what'll happen is we have our on-campus incident commander, whether it's that person out on the field or the head of school or whoever else. And then immediately following that, the police show up. And as soon as the police show up, the police department will actually take over that role as incident commander. And when they take over that role and they start leading that charge as incident commanders, then the incident commander on campus can step into a little bit smaller role. And by the way, it looks like we just had a quick technical difficulty. So for one reason or another, it seems like our connection was lost. If we did lose you, don't worry, just hit refresh on your page and we'll pop right back up for you. But I'll give everybody just a quick second to do that before I go on. All right, it looks like everybody's back in. Excellent. So that incident commander role, once the police department gets there, or in a fire, once the fire department gets there, it's going to transition to somebody else who has more experience and who is a better quote unquote incident commander, and allow your school's incident commander to go back to that smaller role, which is communicating, figuring out what the school's doing next, figuring out where we go back to school the next day, and so on and so forth. Then there's a safety director, and the safety director is actually a really interesting position and very necessary one. It's one that for a long time actually wasn't available for various different reasons. But the safety director is one that essentially receives and disseminates all information for the command center. So put differently, and I'll show you a chart here in just a moment, the safety director is going to find out that the search and rescue team found somebody, going to record that wherever it makes the most sense, and then they'll advise the incident commander at a time that makes sense and a time that they're ready to hear that. The way we came to the safety director conclusion was and we'll use your head of school as an example and just to help sort of bring some context to it. You know that if your head of school is in the middle of getting ready for a board meeting and is stressed as can be about one of the topics that's going to be addressed, they're concerned, they're working hard, they've been there until 9 o'clock at night every day for the last 4 days getting ready for it. that's probably not the best day to go to them and talk about a new program. Or on the flip side, if they just got through that board meeting, let's say it's Friday morning, the board meeting happened on Thursday night, everything's all well and good, they're feeling really positive about how it happened and how it went, that's a perfect time to go to them and say, hey, this is an idea I have, how about we try this out? Well, the safety director is somebody who's in the position to be aware of the mindset of your incident commander and who's able to help make a judgment call about when the appropriate time to present information is. And so in a more emergency related example, your safety director is somebody who's going to look at the incident commander and say, can this person take on any more stress? Can this person help be productive if I give this information to them? And if not, is there anybody else who could be more productive if I gave that information to them? So it's almost like a filter or a person to just get the information and then determine when best to say, hey, here's what we need to do about it. It's important that the safety director is transparent and isn't withholding information that needs to be communicated. For example, if there's a severe student injury or there's a parent who shows up on campus and expects to pick up a child and they're having difficulty at the reunification gate figuring out how to make that happen, the safety director probably needs to just turn around and say, hey, this is what's going on, and find a way to help the incident commander come up with a strategy for it. But at the same time, if it's something like, hey, there are 5 teachers who say they want to go home today and it's after an earthquake and we're not really ready to release anybody, that's something that could be delayed a little bit, or a conversation that could be had a little bit later on. So there's a lot of judgment calls that need to be able to be made by the safety director, and for that reason, it should be somebody who's comfortable making those calls, who's aware of who your incident commander is and all of the people who might be an incident commander, and can really help lead and help provide infrastructure and information when the incident commander turns around and needs it. Then there's an external communications person and an internal communications person, and those stand to reason. They're the people who communicate. Externally, we would generally consider to be your parent community, your neighbors, your region, if there were a conversation or communication that needed to go out to local police, the FBI, anybody else. Internal communication tends to be staff and faculty and potentially students. And those aren't hard, fast rules. There are a lot of schools that will say internal communications will handle staff, faculty, students, and parents. And there are other schools that will say external communications will handle parents, faculty, and staff, and students. Internal communications will only handle the emergency response teams. Doesn't make a huge difference so long as you're training and you're practicing and you're aware of where those lines are drawn. You've got your planning team, and oftentimes your planning team is also referred to as your continuity team. And in fact, I'll show you a chart again in a little while here that will show you exactly where that might be. But other times you might find that the planning team is actually just one person and they're right in the command center. So it doesn't matter either way, again, so long as you practice, you're comfortable with it, and it actually works. And perhaps most important, you have documentation. And oftentimes I actually break documentation up into 2 groups. And so if you haven't thought about this before, it's at least something to run through your mind and kind of let sit for a day or 2. But documentation is something that by its very nature is intended to be static, right? It's intended to be, I understand that this person is missing at 2:53 p.m. I wrote it down. And that way at 3:55, I can look back and say, hey, that person was missing at 2:53. Hopefully I got those times right. Well, emergencies aren't quite so static, and things change and things are fluid and they move quickly. And so sometimes that static information recording isn't as productive as it could be if it were a little bit more dynamic. And so what I'll often do is I'll actually set up a second person to be dynamic documentation. And more often than not, if I do that, I set that person up with a whiteboard. So that person is literally recording on a whiteboard what's going on. And we're all looking at that whiteboard to get almost like a dashboard sort of awareness of what's going on and what's happening. And then there's a second person who is in the static position who's literally documenting everything that happens. So it's their job to just say, hey, this is what's happening, this is what I'm aware of, and document it as they go. The question almost always comes up, well, where did this come from? Why did we end up with all these different choices and people and teams, and how did all of this happen? Well, there's an overall concept that's called NIMS, and it stands for the National or Nationalized, different people refer to it differently, Incident Management System, or put differently, the way that the entire country is going to manage an emergency after it happens. And the system is designed to be resilient and to be foolproof almost, and also to be really well managed sort of for the masses. So put differently, if all schools in your region all are having the same trouble, the system allows one person on the overall region's planning team to contact you, say, hey, what's going on? And what do I need to do about it? And they can do that with all of your school's planning teams or all of your school's external communications teams or people. And they can get the information they need. They can pass it over to the logistics or the operations team who might say, hey, these are the ways that we're going to deal with this. And then they can move right along. So it's not something that you necessarily need to be mindful of or even train all staff and faculty on, but it is good to know that at the back of your mind that there is some overall structure to how these concepts came up or came to be, and how they've found their way onto various school campuses and business settings and everywhere else. The government actually intentionally created these so that we all had something to adopt that would be relatively similar so that they could come in and ultimately help us more easily. We'll talk about that a little bit later on today. So this is a graph, and we actually showed this to you last week, but the teams that you generally are training and working with and checking in with on a regular basis are continuity, counseling, first aid, search and rescue, reunification, attendance, long-range care, and rover. Those are the teams that get most of our energy. This command center, and in fact, on this graph, it looks like it's just 2 people, and believe it or not, it can be, doesn't get a whole lot of attention. So our incident commander, our safety director, and the rest of our command center that we just talked about, all of those people are going to sit in a single cell, and a cell being an Excel cell like this, and are theoretically going to be in charge of and responsible for everybody else, all of these other teams that are on campus. Now again, whether the command center, just like any of these other teams, is 15 people or 5 or 2, doesn't necessarily make a huge difference, so long as they have the capacity to truly oversee all of these teams and to truly lead everybody through an emergency, small, large, or in between. Now, who makes up the command center? The head of school, generally speaking, is going to be on the command center. So if you have a head of school who has specifically said, I'm not comfortable being on the command center, or after an emergency, I have other responsibilities that I need to tend to, or anything like that, know that it's not a firm rule, right? That person does not need to be part of the command center, but more often than not, they are. The chief financial officer or business manager, if you're in a smaller school, you might refer to the finance person as business manager. If you're in a larger school, you might call them your CFO. You might not call them either of those 2 things, but whoever it is who has ultimate financial leadership on campus should also be a part of the command center. And those 2 people, the head of school and the chief financial officer or business manager, whoever that person is, those 2 people together can make a lot of really quick decisions. In fact, they do it on a regular basis, and they're used to working with each other, so they can be sort of complementary to one another in terms of how they make decisions, how they talk, how they approach challenges and tackle hard problems. But those 2 people aren't generally enough to make up the whole command center. Oftentimes, and we find this true especially in California, although occasionally on the East Coast, in the Northwest, and some other places, the facilities leadership team or facilities manager, director, whoever that person is on campus, will also be a part of the command center. And in California, almost, no, I can't say that. I'll say about half the time, the facilities person, whoever that is, that facilities director, manager, etc., is the safety director. And so their role, their job is to be that filter. There's somebody who might not be part of the senior leadership team or part of the highest level discussions that occur on campus, but they're very engaged and are very aware of where everybody else's strengths are. They have the time to invest in really making sure that people are trained well, and they have the desire to really focus on everybody's training and make sure that it actually is getting done. And so for that reason, they very frequently find themselves in the safety director role. Communications and or marketing, depending on how big or small your school is and what the infrastructure looks like, oftentimes there is a director of communications, and if there's not, there might be a director of marketing. If there's not, there might be somebody who generally does the marketing. And if that person is a full-time employee and they're generally on campus, that's a great person to have be a part of the command center. And whether they report to the head of school or the business office doesn't make a huge difference. But what they're really good at and what they do all day, every day, is they create language. And believe it or not, sometimes in an emergency, creating language is one of the hardest things to do. And we take really good writers, people who are excellent at writing and do so all the time. And we say to them, hey, can you just write this piece real quick? And we do it in 2.5 minutes. And they say, whoa, 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 I can't. And so regardless of whether it's somebody who is doing this on a regular basis and doing this frequently or not, whoever it is that you're going to put in that external or internal communication role, or both for that matter, should really have the training and the confidence to generate a piece in just 2 or 3 minutes. And that piece might be as simple as lockdown right now, or it could be as complex as we're going to lock down right now because there's something going on down the street. We need you to be aware of it. And so for the next 15 minutes, we'll be in lockdown, and so on and so forth. But no matter what, those people should be practicing frequently enough, and frankly should have some templates built, even if they don't use them, as a resource and something to pull out of their back pocket if they absolutely need to. And then other people that oftentimes make their way to the command center, and really for good reason, are other people that are part of the senior leadership team. So if you have somebody who's in advancement, or you have somebody who's in admissions, or maybe somebody who's a dean, maybe it's somebody who is in communications, whatever the rest of that leadership team looks like for your school, I would suggest at least considering whether or not those people could be productive and valuable in the command center. It's not to say that they can always. In fact, oftentimes they cannot. There are times where it makes the most sense for those people to be in a totally different role, very, very distant from the command center, because they just don't have the knowledge and expertise, or they don't have the patience, or they don't want to be around the command center. So there are dozens of reasons that it may not actually make sense for those people to be a part of it. But at the same time, it's one of those things that you can think about. And the reason for it is that the senior leadership team, weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, whatever it may be, maybe even daily for your school, is a team that is used to and frequently does make decisions that impact the entire community. And so that team altogether is truly the core and the group that runs the rest of the school. Consider allowing them to do that during an emergency, and consider allowing them to leverage everybody's potential and everybody's different perspective after an emergency, just the way that they do on a regular day. And if as you consider that, it feels like it's the right decision, it probably is. And again, if as you consider that, you go, hey, you know what? This person cannot be a part of the command center. They will just have a panic attack, or they'll cause somebody else to have a panic attack. Know that you're not alone, and that is absolutely okay. Just make sure that you get them a different job, a different role that makes more sense for them. And finally, who else should be on the command center? You. So if you're a part of this webinar and you're somebody who's been on this series throughout the last couple of weeks, couple of months, maybe even all year, there's a good chance that you now, if not before, have the knowledge and expertise to at least contribute. And so regardless of who you are and what you do, and regardless of where you typically fall in the emergency process, and I would assume that many of you, especially those of you that are as committed as some of you are already a part of the command center or already a part of the response team. But I would at least consider having you be a part of that command center. If you're somebody, and this actually often happens for the first aid team or the medical team, what'll happen is there's a nurse on campus, and so the nurse automatically says, well, I should be part of the first aid or the medical team. That part, very true. Then the nurse will say, well, you know what, I should probably lead that team because I have the background, the knowledge, and the experience to really do well on that team. That sometimes isn't so true. And what sometimes happens is the nurse ends up leading so much that he or she isn't able to be hands-on and provide care. And in doing so, we have a bunch of teachers who maybe are just CPR and first aid certified, or potentially are certified in something else altogether, or not at all. And so the leader becomes and is somebody who knows all of the answers, has a lot of information, and potentially can be underutilized. Well, if that's happening with you, if you're feeling like you've got this information, you could be a really effective safety director or incident commander, mention it. And make sure that when you do it, mention it, that it's heard. And share the reasons why, and share the role that you'd like to fill. And oftentimes people are willing to shift and move where you fall in the overall perspective or on that overall org chart to make sure that we are best utilizing you and obviously using you as much as possible. Now, what does the command center need in order to make all this work? Well, long story short, the command center really needs to be able to have a space to actually do their job. So a space to show up, a space to do their role, and a space that can be blocked or otherwise have a barrier created from students, staff, and faculty. One of the things that we test a lot, and this typically happens during our big Moulage drills, and in fact, it looks like we just put up the Moulage Drill note there, so you can see a little bit more about what that is on the right-hand side of your screen. But one of the things that we oftentimes will test there is we'll actually have a student, a staff member, or even a faculty member, sometimes even a parent, literally just lose their emotional stability. So run towards the command center, say, I need to go home right now because this is all a conspiracy and I just can't stay here any longer. Well, if that does happen, and incidentally, the reason that we test that in the Moulage drill is because it does happen. So if it does happen, what we need to make sure that the command center can do is get away from it and continue the discussion, continue the dialogue, and ultimately continue to lead the school. And so it's not enough just to have a space set aside. We really need to have a space and then also have a backup plan, a way to either create an obstruction so people can't get to us, or move into a secret place, quote unquote, somewhere nobody would expect to find us. Or sometimes we create a space through technology. So that space might be just text message or Google Chat if you're a Google Apps school. Sometimes it might be the head of school's house if the head of school lives on campus or near campus. If it's a boarding school, it might be somebody else's house. Doesn't make any difference where that space is so long as everybody knows where it is. And if you decide to move it, that everybody knows where to go. The team also needs some infrastructure. And the big and most important things that they absolutely need are the technology, the emergency notification system, the ability to communicate to external people, people like the media, people like parents, probably in a different order, the ability to communicate to closer to home people like our board, for example, if we need to get somebody there to help us make a decision. So they're going to need all of that infrastructure available to them. And it doesn't matter how they do that. For most emergency notification systems, there's the ability to either log onto a computer, pull up a website, and actually handle any sort of communication that you need to on the computer. They also, and in fact, most people do that most of the time. Well, most of these systems also have the ability for you to pick up the phone and dial into a number and say to somebody on the support team, hey, I need you to send out a message on my behalf because I can't. I don't have internet access. I don't have X, Y, or Z. And so if internet's down and you don't have VoIP phones, it might be as simple as just picking up the phone and calling. If internet's down and you do have VoIP phones, it might be trying to find a landline of some sort. If internet's down, phone lines are down, email is down, all of those things are inaccessible. You may just have to manage without the infrastructure and create a new way on the fly to communicate. Or it may be driving down the street to see what somebody else's infrastructure looks like. So it's one of these things where infrastructure in general is really a want more than it is a need, but it very much does help create and foster a much quicker process for communication and also a much safer environment, both present and into the future. The team needs to be agile. So the team needs to be able to go, hey, you know what, this is where we are right now. This is what's going on right now. In 10 minutes, this could all change, and that's okay. We're going to roll with the punches. So it's something that in each command center training that you do, whether it's a tabletop or a full-scale exercise, a Moulage drill, I would always suggest at least putting in one space change so that they have to move from, let's say, your head's office to a room somewhere else on campus, or they move from the front of the group if everybody's evacuated to a classroom that's towards the other side of the campus where perhaps that's where they set up the command center. And getting them into the habit and practice of moving back and forth and things like that will both help you figure out how to move them in the event that you need to and help them feel comfortable with that move. They obviously need a plan, and for most of you that boils down to your emergency plan. They also need to practice. They need to do this on a regular basis and make sure that they actually have an understanding for what their roles are. And again, we've already talked about the technology pieces that are most helpful for them. One of the questions that I got last week, and I didn't actually share it with everybody, was, you put these ... after, or these, 3 dots after every communication slide that you do. How come? And I said, because communication is always one of the challenges that we have to discuss when we debrief an emergency. Every time, whether it's internal, like our own Joffe staff reviewing after an emergency was handled, or external, as in somebody on a school campus and just reviewing what happened on campus, whether the emergency is small or huge or really, really huge, it's always something that comes up and inevitably is something that can be done better. So when we start any sort of response, and incidentally, when we show up on campus or show up on the phone to help a school manage an emergency, we generally call it a response. And so when we start a response, one of the first things that I'll say is, everybody, I want you to be thinking about 2 things today. The first is that we need to make sure that when we debrief, communication is not on the list of things that we could have done better. Let's communicate well, let's communicate fast, and let's make sure that we're consistent with how we do it. Second, everybody sit down. And this is one of the things that happens very, very frequently when we walk into a command center, is I'll look around and people are standing up and they're stressed and biting nails and jotting down notes on paper and doing the best they can to write essays on a small Post-it. And they've got it flipped over 3 times and folded up, and they're just working to get every little bit of space they can off of that piece of paper. And I say, hey, there's a legal pads on that table right next to you. Do you want to switch over and maybe use that? And they go, oh, sure. Yeah, good idea. And then I say, hey, there's a chair right behind you. Do you want to sit down? You look a little anxious right now. And they say, oh, sure. And within minutes of doing that, we watch the entire room transform, really, from a room full of anxiety to a room full of confidence and capacity, and a room that's actually pushing for change and helping us move through and lead the community through this emergency. So that was a long-winded way of saying communication is among the most difficult things in any emergency. And the reason for it is that oftentimes as things happen, we don't have a lot of information. And so there's not much to communicate. And when we don't have a lot of information, it becomes very difficult for us to communicate, because we don't want to give miss or inaccurate or just not enough information when we finally are able to deliver it. And so what almost always happens is that we just wait too long to deliver any sort of communication that needs to be delivered. I was at a Moulage Drill a couple of weeks ago, and the concept of the drill involved lockdown. And so basically what we were going to do was move from a great day, regular day, into lockdown, because somebody walked in the front door and said, hey, it's time to lock down. It took almost 3 minutes to deliver that lockdown message, and that's communication that's just taking too long, because at 3 minutes, that person who was at the front office could have been anywhere. And so speed, especially in the initial moments of an emergency, has to outweigh completion. It doesn't necessarily need to outweigh good messaging or doing a good job to remain leaders as you move through the emergency. But it does mean, and it does need to supersede the desire to get really complete and really comprehensive information out. Now, who does the command center need to communicate to? Everybody. Who do they need to communicate from? Everyone. Who shouldn't communicate? The incident commander. And one of the things we talk about a lot is that in the midst of an emergency, text message using your emergency notification system is one of the best ways to communicate to an entire audience, right? Students, staff, faculty, parents, board, anybody else for that matter, neighbors, police. It just works really well. Well, your incident commander probably has no idea how to use your emergency notification system, and that's totally okay. They don't need to. Albeit, more than one person on campus does need to know how to use your emergency notification system. But it doesn't need to be your incident commander because, again, they probably don't need to actually send the message. That's a message that can be sent, it can be templated months in advance, and then it can just be delivered when the time is right. Well, afterwards, there's often another message that goes out that says, hey, everybody, this is what happened, this is how we made it through, and this is what you need to do differently. And then after that, and this is where the incident commander often does come in, there's a voice recording that will go out. And I'll share with you just a quick scenario. So let's take 11 o'clock in the morning, a fire breaks out on campus. everybody's evacuated to a parking lot. And as soon as they get to the parking lot, the fire gets put out, everybody gets to go back into the buildings, and we just do class differently for the rest of the day. So that one part of the building we're not doing class in. Well, immediately our communication tactic was to pull the fire alarm, right? Get everybody out. Then our tactic was, when everybody got back in, we sent out an email that said, hey, everybody, this is what happened. This is the schedule for the rest of the day. Well, that night, it's often a good idea for your incident commander, your head of school, your communications person, in some cases, it's even been me, to pick up the phone and to call families. And this can be an auto recording. It doesn't mean you have to call 500 families. So you can pre-record it. And in fact, most of your emergency notification systems will allow you to do that. But to pick up the phone, to call families and to say, today, this is what happened. And today, this is how our community came together and responded and was effective in doing so. And these are the things, and these are some of the people that really stood out, deserve to be highlighted in this communication. And here's what's going to happen differently tomorrow. And that message generally, just as a best practice, shouldn't be longer than about a minute. But a quick, connected, and sort of almost live message from your head or whoever it is that's going to lead it can oftentimes help the community stay engaged and stay with you through the emergency. Now, in a fire, it makes a lot more sense to do this communication, and it makes a lot less sense that people would become disengaged from the community. In another type of emergency, let's put an emergency that has to do with a staff or faculty member on campus, it might make a little bit more sense that people could become disengaged if we're not really actively communicating. So you can think about some of the scenarios that it might make more sense to do this in, and certainly it doesn't need to be a firm rule for every single emergency. We always do it. But it is something to at least consider for most events that come up. Now, something else to consider is that if you are head of school, for example, is your incident commander, and there's a region-wide event. Let's take a lockdown that impacts your whole neighborhood, or an earthquake, or a hurricane that comes on very quickly, a tornado that perhaps we didn't have a whole lot of warning for. Not only do they have the school to be concerned about, but they have personal concerns to be worried about, right? They have a family at home, theoretically. They've got people who they need to be checking in on, and people who they need to pick up from school, kids that they need to be worried about, going, hey, I wonder if my kid's school actually has a safety program. I wonder if they're doing what we're doing right now. I wonder if my kid's okay. Asking all of those questions. And so one of the things that I like to do, and this works really well if it's your head of school and they have an assistant, it doesn't work quite as well if it's not your head of school or if your head of school doesn't have an assistant. But I like to have somebody take away their personal cell phone. And somebody else, whether their assistant or just somebody on campus, monitor any calls or text messages that are coming in and communicate to family, to anybody else that they're okay and all of those types of things. Create next steps, figure out how they're going to pick up kids if they haven't done that already. Deal with all of the personal issues that will inevitably come up with a regional emergency. And frankly, this is even true if it's isolated to your school, because a lot of people are going to be calling to say, hey, is everything okay? Hey, can I help? Hey, what can I do? Things like that. But have somebody take that phone away so that that set of issues can be dealt with over there. And you can't see it, but I'm pointing to way over there, in an environment that those issues can really be well heard and well addressed, and have the school's issues be managed by the incident commander, who needs to really be serving and focusing on the school. Now, the challenges that go along with the command center are pretty logical, I'll say. I wanted to say standard, but they're really not, but they do make sense. Staff, faculty, student, parent, emotional emergencies. Those will happen. Parents will show up, will try to jump fences to try and pick up kids, and will yell and scream and do all of the things that they might do on a regular day anyway, in an emergency. Staff and faculty will have emotional challenges. Where's my kid? Where's my spouse? How do I pick up my kid? I'm not sure that we're doing the right things here. Should we be doing something differently? I don't have enough communication. All of those types of things are going to come up for staff and faculty. And so we need to be prepared to manage those, whether it's by consoling them or just discussing and engaging in some dialogue with them, or asking them to leave. There are a number of different ways that we can deal with those things, but there are challenges that will come up. And then for our students, and this is actually why we did the command center right after counseling, more often than not, those emotional challenges are manifested by acting out in various different ways. It could be that they just say, I'm leaving, and they get up and start to walk away. It could be that they have other issues that are going on that are just within their social network. And so we need to be aware of those things, spot those things, and then make sure that we're actually doing something about those things. We want to create barriers when we're a command center, right? And we talked about that earlier. We want to make sure that if we need to restrict access to our space, that we can do that. And at the same time, most heads of school, when I present that idea to them, say, "What? You've got to be kidding me. There's no way that I'm going to create a barrier between me and my school, me and my community, in the midst of an emergency when they need me most." And so the challenge that I'll share with you there is not so much just creating the barrier, it's creating a barrier that makes sense for you, makes sense for your incident commander, and that feels comfortable and feels like it's something you can actually stick to. Managing competing and fluid priorities is perhaps the most difficult part of any command center. And the reason for that is logical, right? If I have news that I need to pick up or find 5 people, and then the next thing I know, I need to treat 15 people, and the next thing I know, I've got parents showing up at my gate, and the next thing I know, I've got emotional emergencies happening over there, and then I have my own personal emergencies to deal with. All of those things have to be able to come up, have to be discussed, have to be prioritized, and then have to be managed. But I don't necessarily have the ability to do that as a single person, as one person. I can't do it, frankly. And so you've got to be able to rely on the rest of the command center to take on those roles, really rely on those safety directors to bring in the information that's necessary, to raise it at the appropriate time, and then to sometimes even let it sit for a little while until it's an appropriate time. Communication, I just couldn't tell you, I can't tell you enough how much of a challenge that is. And then anxiety. And this is an interesting one. So I'll share with you that not very long ago, we had a car chase that ended up on a school campus. And the school immediately dialed 911, which was ironic because there were already police on campus that were chasing this person onto campus. But they called nonetheless. And it was actually probably a good idea. The person ran through campus, and then the person disappeared on campus. And so what ended up happening is we had a whole bunch of police and a whole bunch of response, no idea where this person was, and a lot of kids on campus. And when I got to the command center, which was about a half an hour after this all started, it was a school that I happened to be in the area for. It was pretty incredible. I walked in and I saw about 15 adults, all staff and faculty of the school, and then another about 7 police officers, all standing up, all in a circle, literally around the conference table. And so I said to them, "Hey, you know what? Why don't we all have a seat?" And so we did. And then I said, "Hey, is anybody hungry?" And a couple of people laughed, and a couple of people gave me dirty looks, which was fair. But then we ordered pizza, and we got some sodas going. We got some waters going. We had some salads. And I said, "Everybody, you know what? At this point, the police are doing what they can do to find this person. That's got to be the priority. We've got to let them do that. So what else can we do in the meantime?" And we started game planning on how we were going to figure out who was on campus and where they were, and who was impacted, how we were going to evacuate class by class. But just the simple act of sitting down and putting some food in front of people reduced the anxiety to the point where, as opposed to being almost stoic like they were when I walked in, they were having this really good conversation about what we could do. And in the midst of trying to figure out what the rest of the plan was, we made a determination about what the after-school program was going to look like, and what the following day of school would look like, and what the next day of school would look like, and what the parent meetings would look like, where we discussed and debriefed what had happened. And so I share that story with you because I want to remind you that there are so many different ways to manage an emergency, and so many different ways to allow emergencies to manage us, that it's important to at least ask yourself, am I working with this emergency as calmly as I possibly can be? And in doing so, is that setting me up to be as productive as I can be? And if so, then you've done a good job. And if not, then you've got some digging and some thinking to do. The big action that needs to take place in any emergency is, and these are really the key next steps, although I'll go over a couple of other next steps with you next, the incident command model. As soon as you decide this is a thing, Decide it's a thing and form your incident command teams. Get food going, and think food and think fast. Get food in front of people as quickly as you possibly can, and that's not just the command center, it's everybody, but it definitely helps for the command center. Stay on script. So if you remember this from last week, we talked about the importance of a script in crisis counseling and sort of managing difficult scenarios and situations. Well, that's very true here too. It tends to be a little bit more dynamic when we deal with a big emergency as an organization as opposed to a big emergency for one person. However, we still need to stay on script. We need to make sure the right people are doing the right roles and that they're practiced to the point that they can do it without the script in front of them, quite literally. And then last but not least, make sure that everybody in the command center is comfortable asking for help anytime they need help. So there are some key next steps that'll help make sure that you're really ready to sort of leverage all of the information that we've talked about today. The first is to set up a Moulage Drill. And it looks like we just put that Moulage Drill post back up. If you haven't set up a Moulage Drill with us yet or on your own yet, definitely make sure that you set one up. And just a quick reminder, Moulage Drills are these drills where we actually put fake blood and scenarios with students and staff and faculty, sometimes even parents, and search and rescue has to go into the buildings, find the people, and actually figure out a way to extricate them. And then first aid has to figure out a way to treat them, and the attendance team has to account for them. Ultimately, reunification has to release them to parents and anybody else who needs to pick them up. And so you don't necessarily need us in order to do one, but we certainly would love to help. The key steps to think about, whether you're using us or you're doing one on your own, are you always need to communicate in advance to parents that this is something that you'll be doing. You generally will have to create a special schedule for the day, unless you do a really short one. Generally, our Moulage Drills are somewhere around 90 minutes to an hour, but they certainly could go a little shorter or even a little longer. I'm sorry, 90 minutes to 2 hours. You then want to make sure that you lead a staff and faculty meeting as close to the Moulage Drill as possible so that you can really make sure people are comfortable with their roles. They know what to do, they know what's expected of them, and they have a good understanding for what they'll actually do in the drill. And then finally, you want to do it. And afterwards, then you want to survey and make sure that you meet with staff and faculty again. So those are some key components. And for some of our schools, we do all of those. For others, we do just some of those. If you're interested in one, make sure that you click and get signed up, and we can get in touch and schedule some time and really figure out what it is that your school wants to do and what your goals are with the drill. Next, review your protocol manual or your emergency plan to ensure that it's complete and it's comprehensive, that it includes a plan of action for your command center. Make sure that you actually have tested that. And one of the things that I often will recommend for a new school is that you literally print that out, right? You print out your command center's plan. Then you go through a tabletop or even a Moulage Drill and you follow that plan. And as you find things that either don't fit or are in the wrong order, or maybe just you need to add a few things, handwrite them in. And then at the end of that drill, take all of those things you hand wrote, add them to the document, scratch out or delete anything that you scratched out on paper. And now you've got a true plan that you can actually use in an emergency. Review other services that you may want or need to lean on. So this goes back to some of the conversations we've had in the last few weeks. Your counseling team is more often than not going to need some help. Your continuity team is more often than not going to need some help. Your search and rescue team may need some help from local fire, depending on what's going on. Your reunification team might need some help from police. So just review those other services and programs and make sure that you've got an outline for how you're going to access the help and support that you may want and need. And then this is probably my favorite part. Review each team's preparedness. So as the command center, you're responsible for all of the teams that are out there, all of the team's roles and responsibilities. You're responsible for everything that they do. So check in with them and ask them if they actually know what they're supposed to do. Again, if you're a Google Apps school, you can use a Google form to do that. If you're not, you can use SurveyMonkey. I think it might be free. I'm not sure. If not, and if you don't want to spend anything on it, you can literally have everybody in a staff and faculty meeting raise their hand if they're comfortable and not if they're not. Sometimes I'll have everybody cover their eyes before they do that, just to make it a little bit less daunting for people to raise their hand and say, no, I'm not really sure, I need some help. But I would ask at least these 3 questions. Do you know your role? Have you practiced it? And what challenges do you think you might find? And the goal, and we've sort of crescendo into that big question, but we start with, do you actually know what you're supposed to be doing? Okay, great. Have you practiced it? Have you tested it out? Do you think that this will actually work? And then by asking what challenges they think that they might find, we're getting, well, one, into just an open-ended question that will result in some good dialogue. But also we're getting into this space where we're testing how deep people's understanding of their role really is. So do they actually feel comfortable enough? Well, we might find out when they turn back and say, you know, the biggest challenge I'm going to have is just stepping into my role. Or we might find out that somebody really has a keen understanding of their role if they say, here are the 5 challenges I think I'm going to find, and here are the ways that I'm going to try to solve those problems. So again, not necessarily required questions, but I would very much suggest at least those 3. And finally, tabletop. So whether this is something that you've done in the past or not, a tabletop drill is an opportunity for your command center and potentially everybody else on campus to review a critical incident. Let's take a lockdown, for example, and start with, at the beginning of the lockdown, when somebody walks up to you and says, you need to lock down, how would you do it? And have everybody write that down. And then say, and what would you do next? And have everybody write that down. And at some point you can transition back into a team approach where everybody comes together by text message or phone call or physically, and you can talk about what that whole team will be doing. But I challenge you to actually start each of these with, what is your role, what is your responsibility, and what are you doing, as opposed to what are we doing? So with that, I have just a couple of questions that I'll answer here in just a second. Because I went over last time, I want to make sure that I do share with you the 2 offers that we have for you, or the 2 thoughts that we have for you. The first is, and we've been talking a little bit about the Moulage Drill throughout today's conversation, a lot about it throughout the rest of the series. We would love to be able to help you conduct a Moulage Drill on campus, whether that's really, really small or really, really big. Doesn't make a big difference to us. We're happy to help either way. But we want to make sure that you've had the opportunity to test all of the systems and the teams that we've been talking about, and that you do actually have a good understanding for what each role is and how they communicate and how they challenge each other. So if you haven't set up a Moulage Drill yet, now is certainly the time to do so. I did want to share with you, and I think the last time we talked about Moulage Drills, we did not mention that the maximum cost is $2,000 as opposed to the minimum cost. So put differently, if you decide that you'd like us to do a really small scale moulage and maybe not do any sort of communication leading up to it, the cost for that's going to be a lot less than if you decide you want us to do everything. But if you decide you want us to do everything, the cost will be a total maximum of $2,000. With that, if you're on this webinar and you're already a client, you're already on a Vitals or an Essentials contract, obviously you already have access to that drill. Either way, it looks like the on-campus assessment, which I'll get to here in a second, is what is up for you. You're welcome to click that. That is entirely free to you, and it's actually free to you whether you're a client or not. But essentially that on-campus assessment allows us to come to campus and review your action plan with you, take a look at all of the different challenges that you've tried to come up with solutions for. If you've watched these webinars and you've been taking notes throughout the series, we'll actually look at those notes with you. It was pretty neat. We just did an assessment with somebody the other day where they had a whole list of questions and challenges from each webinar that we had done all year. So thank you, first of all, for watching all of them. But also, thank you for giving us the opportunity to learn a little bit more about what challenges you had. And so in doing so, then we'll present back a set of sort of next steps for you. And some of those may include us helping, some of those may be things that you do on your own, but there's no pressure whatsoever, and it's entirely free. So both of those are available for you for participating today, and we'll continue to offer something at the end of each webinar that we do, just to make sure that we keep you incentivized and excited about coming back and talking with us. So with that, and to avoid going over time, there are 2 really good questions. I'm going to follow up with both of you by email, and I'll shoot you an email here in the next couple of minutes. But I'd like to say thank you so much to everybody for being with us. I'm really excited that next week we're actually going to begin to wrap up the mini series. And we're also going to announce, and for those of you that haven't heard this yet, we're delaying the announce of the rest of the year because we just added 1 new product and we can't really figure out which webinar spot to put it in. It's such an exciting topic, we can't let it go, but we also are out of spaces. through the end of the year. So as soon as we finalize that and we decide which webinar to bump, we'll share the rest of the series with you, and we'll probably do that on Monday with the email that goes out. But if not, we will definitely share it with you on Thursday. So all of that said, we can't tell you how much we appreciate you being on this webinar with us. We're excited to be rounding out the mini-series. We've just got 3 left: rovers, security, and logistics. In the meantime, you're more than welcome to either ask any questions that you have today, email us at schools@joffeeemergencyservices.com, or you can also tweet us at Joffe Emergency. And that's the first time that I've ever had to say that. So hopefully I said that right. With that, I hope you have a great weekend, a great rest of the day. If you're in San Francisco, hope you have safe travels home. We can't wait to see you next week. Thank you.